un sobre carmesí, sin remitente, solo en nombre, y un secreto que nadie debería saber. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión Justino. ¿Desde qué lugar del mundo nos estás viendo? Déjanos un comentario. Vuestras voces dan vida a estos misterios. Los leo todos con alegría. Comencemos. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos. Soy su anfitrión Santiago. Dime, ¿desde qué parte del mundo nos acompañas esta noche? Siempre es una alegría leer tus comentarios. Comencemos. And it was the sort of English spring morning that could deceive it. The ice and light lay gently across the hedgerows of Little Whitford, casting gold upon dew-drenched grass, but the air still held the chill of March. Daffodils nodded amiably in front gardens, and Mrs. Lillian Marchmont was laying out the tea things on her lace-covered table as if nothing in the world could disturb the order of her garden party. It was not a grand affair, no more than a dozen neighbours, old friends, and curious newcomers were invited to mark her cousin's return from India. The cousin in question, Mr. Henry Calthorpe, was an angular man with a quiet smile and eyes that missed nothing. He was freshly retired, and, judging by the silver-topped cane he leaned on, already feeling the weight of years. Still, he was charming and mild, which made what followed all the more unsettling. Miss Jane Marple, who had been persuaded to attend by Mrs. Weatherby from the vicarage, sat with a modest scone in hand and an unobtrusive ear tilted toward the gathering. Her presence was always somehow quiet, like a faded chair in the corner of the room that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. The guests were mid-chat: Mrs. Brandon chattering about her dahlias, the vicar's wife sharing an anecdote about a misplaced baptismal record when the envelope appeared. It was lying on the tea tray as if it had always been there. No one had seen who placed it. It was of a curious reddish hue, sealed with wax, and addressed in large, sweeping script simply to H.C. It bore no postage, no return address. The air seemed to shift subtly around the table as Mr. Calthorpe picked it up. He chuckled uneasily. "One of you has a flair for the dramatic," he said, breaking the seal. He read only the first line before his complexion altered, first to a sickly white, then a blotchy red. Without another word, he folded the letter, placed it neatly back into the envelope, and tucked it into his coat. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, rising shakily. "A sudden headache. If you'll excuse me, shall I fetch Dr. Partridge?" offered Mrs. Marchmont, but Henry was already halfway to the gate, waving her off with his cane. The garden, so recently filled with bird-song and polite laughter, fell into an uneasy hush. By the following morning, Mr. Calthorpe was dead. The official account: heart failure. He had been found slumped in his chair by the hearth, still dressed. From the party, the crimson letter resting on the table beside a half-drunk brandy. There were no signs of disturbance, no poison detected, no visible trauma, only the doctor's vague assertion that the heart sometimes simply gives out. Yet Miss Marple, who had always believed that hearts rarely gave out without very good reason, was not satisfied. A week passed. Then came the whispers that the letter had not been written in ink at all, but in lipstick, that the handwriting was unmistakably a woman's, that the letter had vanished before the coroner arrived. Little Wythensford had seen its share of oddities: runaway pigs, a scandal about a curate and the grocer's daughter, but this was something darker. Something that lingered like the scent of dead roses in the vicarage hallway. Mrs. Weatherby dropped in to visit Miss Marple one afternoon, hoping for gentle reassurances, as many did. "It's just so terribly sad," she murmured over her tea. "Poor Mr. Calthorpe. I suppose it was simply too much excitement for a man his age." Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery, her eyes mild but alert. "I'm not so sure it was exciting, my dear," she said. "Sometimes it's not what happens, but what's remembered that becomes unbearable." There was a pause, then a clink of spoon on porcelain. Elsewhere in the village, gossip loomed like spring weeds. Some said Mr. Calthorpe had enemies from his time abroad, others whispered of an inheritance dispute, of a woman from his past. But none could explain the letter's disappearance. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty and patient heart, began as she always did with the people. She began with Mrs. Marchmont, then the maid who'd served the tea, then the vicar's wife. A simple question here, a reflective nod there. No grand accusations, no flashing of eyes. Just a puzzle being pieced together, unnoticed. Because there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was this: in an English village, nothing stays buried forever. And someone had written that crimson letter. By the time Sunday services came around, the whole of Little Wythensford was alight with speculation. The air inside St. Christopher's Church was thick with unsaid things, murmured condolences brushed against gossip in the same breath, and every hymn seemed half a note sharp with tension. Miss Marple sat near the back, as she always did, modest in a navy blue hat trimmed with velvet ribbon. Her eyes remained politely lowered, but she missed nothing. She noticed how Mrs. Marchmont dabbed her eyes at odd intervals with a handkerchief that was dry by the time it returned to her lap. She observed how Reverend Altham, who had known Mr. Calthorpe since boyhood, avoided meeting anyone's gaze during his eulogy. Most of all, she noted the absence of one Mrs. Lavinia Marsh, who had made quite a point of speaking to Mr. Calthorpe at length during the garden party. After the service, people gathered in small clusters like birds after a storm. At the churchyard gate, Mrs. Weatherby clung to Miss Marple's elbow with a kind of desperate familiarity. "Have you heard?" she whispered, voice quivering like the last leaf on a branch. "About the letter? They say it's gone. Simply vanished." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her expression neutral. "And now," Mrs. Weatherby continued, breathlessly, "there's talk it was written in red. Red, Jane. Like a scarlet thread. How ghastly. It chills me to think what it must have said to send poor Mr. Calthorpe into such a state." Miss Marple's reply was slow and thoughtful. "It is quite possible," she said, "that it wasn't what the letter said that disturbed him most, but who had written it." She offered no further elaboration, only a faint smile as she adjusted her gloves. Beside them, Mrs. Brandon had cornered Reverend Altham and was asking whether there would be any official statement. He mumbled something about discretion and privacy for the grieving. By Monday, the newspaper from nearby Brimley Anworth ran a small paragraph on page 6 under the heading "Sudden Death at Village Gathering." It mentioned the name Henry Calthorpe, his recent return from India, and a doctor's conclusion of natural causes. Nothing more. No hint of mystery, no crimson letter. But Little Wythensford was not easily placated. The women at the grocer's spoke in tight, hushed tones. The butcher had apparently seen a stranger on the lane near the Marchmont property. The day after the party, tall, dark coat, didn't belong here. Mrs. Driscoll, who hadn't been invited to the party and was keenly bitter about it, claimed she'd heard shouting late that evening coming from the Marchmont drawing-room. Only one voice had not joined the chorus of speculation. Miss Marple. She, unlike the others, had spent the better part of Monday morning taking tea with young Margaret Lane, who had served the garden party in the capacity of housemaid for Mrs. Marchmont. Margaret was new to the village, and eager to impress, but nervous around authority. Miss Marple, however, had long ago perfected the art of not seeming like authority at all. Margaret, rosy-cheeked and jittery, had poured the tea with trembling hands. "It was such a fright, miss," she said. "I didn't even see anyone. slip the letter on the tray. It was just suddenly there. Gave me the shivers, if I'm honest. You didn't notice anyone near it before it appeared? Asked Miss Marple gently. Well, Margaret bit her lip. I was in and out of the kitchen. You see, Mr. Calthorpe was talking to Mrs. Marsh under the arbour. She had her back to me. But she went very still when he opened the envelope. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Did anyone else seem unusually quiet afterward? Margaret considered. Mrs. Marchmont went quite pale. But then, she's a delicate sort. Always gets flustered when things don't go as planned. Indeed, Miss Marple said, with the trace of a smile. And you're certain the letter was on the tray, not handed to him? Oh yes, on the silver tray with the scones. I remember because I nearly picked it up by accident with the napkins. That, Miss Marple thought, was curious. Curious because Mrs. Marchmont herself had claimed the tray came directly from the kitchen, and that she had brought it out to the guests. After leaving Margaret, Miss Marple paid a call on Inspector Cray at the stationer, square-jawed man with a fondness for firm conclusions. Mrs. Marple, he said, with a sigh as she stepped primly into his office. I've already spoken to Dr. Partridge, and there's no evidence of foul play. Heart failure, simple as that. Yes, said Miss Marple, settling into the chair across from him, but heart failure caused by what, Inspector? That is the question. He frowned, tapping a pen on his desk. There's no poison, he said. No signs of distress or injury. Just a man of a certain age, under certain stress, perhaps the excitement of returning home after so long. Possibly, she murmured, but excitement rarely comes in red wax. Cray gave her a sideways glance. The letter, he admitted, is a bit of a puzzle. Mrs. Marchmont claims it was beside him when she found the body. But by the time the doctor arrived, it had disappeared. Stolen? Miss Marple inquired. Or burned, he said. There were traces in the grate, though Partridge says it could have been ordinary rubbish. But who, she said softly, would burn a letter left beside a dead man unless they had something to hide? He said nothing, and she rose. Let us suppose, Miss Marple continued gently, that Mr. Calthorpe's death was, in a manner of speaking, natural. Even so, if that letter hastened it, if it caused such distress that it led to his collapse, would you not still consider the writer responsible? Cray gave a reluctant nod. Yes, well, if you come across anything solid, let me know. She inclined her head and turned to go. Outside, the clouds had shifted. A chill breeze moved along the lane. Across the road, Mrs. Marsh passed by with averted eyes and quickened steps. And back in her sitting-room, Miss Marple returned to her embroidery with a new line of thought forming in the gentle motion of needle through thread. The writer of the crimson letter had not meant to kill, perhaps, but they had written it with purpose, with intent to wound. And Miss Marple had begun to wonder what secret, long buried in the soil of Little Whitford, had suddenly been unearthed. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar mixture of silence and chatter. Silence, because the villagers of Little Whitford had grown watchful, even wary of one another. Chatter, because nature abhors a vacuum, and a mysterious death, followed by a vanished letter, was precisely the kind of vacuum a small English village could not abide. The vicar's wife was heard lamenting to the stationer that the recent sermon, on Proverbs 26, "Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein," had been eerily timely. Mrs. Brandon, more direct, told her butcher in no uncertain terms that she believed someone at that party had blood on their hands, though she would not say who. Miss Marple, on the other hand, said very little. She took up her usual routines, window box, pruning in the morning, a slow walk to the post in the afternoon, a modest turn about the green at dusk, but behind her gentle blue eyes, wheels turned. Experience had taught her that people often revealed the truth when they thought they were merely being sociable, and so she visited, she listened, she observed. Her first port of call was Mrs. Marchmont, the cousin of the deceased and host of the fateful garden party. The Marchmont home stood prim and white at the end of Bellflower Lane, its windows framed with ivy and lace. It was the sort of house that looked as though it ought to smell of lavender and old books. And indeed it did. Mrs. Marchmont received her guest in a parlour, too tidy to have recently lived in. "My dear Jane," she said with a tremor in her voice, "I still cannot make sense of it. Henry seemed perfectly well, perfectly, and then gone." She sat down stiffly, smoothing her skirts. A silver teapot steamed on the tray before her. "He said nothing to you?" asked Miss Marple gently. "Not a word. Just that he had a headache, and left so suddenly. I thought he might have felt overwhelmed. After all, it had been years since he'd seen many of us." Miss Marple stirred her tea with a faint clink of the spoon. "Do you suppose," she said, as if the thought had only just occurred, "that someone might have written to him, perhaps from his past, some old acquaintance seeking resolution?" Mrs. March's fingers paused on her teacup. She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "I wouldn't know," she said after a moment. "Henry wasn't the sort to speak openly of the past. He could be rather private, you know. And yet he accepted your invitation so readily. Well, he was always fond of this village. Said it gave him peace." Miss Marple gave a nod and sipped her tea. Later, as she walked home through the narrow path that skirted the churchyard, she reflected on the way Mrs. Marchmont's voice had gone curiously flat when she mentioned peace. It had been, Miss Marple thought, a very carefully chosen word. Her next stop was a chance encounter, or so it seemed. Mrs. Lavinia Marsh, with her silk scarf and permanently pinched expression, was inspecting plums at the greengrocer's when Miss Marple appeared beside her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said tightly, "terrible business about poor Henry, wasn't it?" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "You spoke with him at length, didn't you? At the party, I mean." Mrs. Marsh's hand froze over a bowl of apricots. She recovered quickly. "Only pleasantries," she said. "He was telling me about his house in Calcutta, such dreadful heat, he said, and the mosquitoes." She gave a brittle laugh. "I'd have never survived it." "You were close, once," Miss Marple said mildly. "I seem to remember you both dancing at the harvest fete the year before he left for India." Mrs. Marsh stiffened. "That was a very long time ago. We were practically children." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as a lullaby. "And yet children remember things very keenly, sometimes better than they do as adults." Mrs. Marsh's lips pressed together in a thin line. She paid for her fruit and left without another word. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, embroidery untouched in her lap. Her thoughts wandered to Henry Calthorpe's life before India. It was remarkable, she thought, how much the village remembered about his time abroad, his retirement, his garden in Calcutta, the cane he brought back, but how little was said about the years before he left. The next day, a new piece of the puzzle arrived, quite literally. Miss Marple was reading on her veranda when young George Lockett, the postman's son, came puffing up the path. "Morning, Miss Marple, got something odd for you." He handed her a small, unmarked envelope, cream-coloured, thick stock, no stamp, no address. Miss Marple's brows lifted. She opened it delicately. Inside was a single scrap of paper. It read, in slanted script, "He should have burned the letter. Some things are better left buried." No signature, no clue as to who had sent it. The handwriting was fluid, but the message was blunt. Miss Marple read it twice before placing it into the small wooden box where she kept curious odds and ends. The sort of box, she often said, that held the truth in fragments. She considered, then walked across the lane to visit her old friend, Colonel Arbuthnot, who had once served in the Indian Army and maintained a detailed journal of local affairs. "Tell me," she asked over port and ginger biscuits, "do you remember when Henry Calthorpe left for India? What year was it?" "Let's see," said the Colonel, eyes narrowing. "Must have been 32. Yes, the very year Lavinia Marsh called off her engagement." Miss Marple's embroidery that evening was particularly precise, for now there were still too many unknowns who had written the crimson letter, who had destroyed it, and why Henry had been so deeply shaken by its contents. But one thread had begun to show through the weave. The letter was no prank, no accident. It was revenge, or warning, perhaps both. And as Miss Marple studied the faces of the village during morning errands or even song hymns, she began to see the subtle flickers guilt in a dropped gaze, fear behind politeness, or a silence too carefully maintained. There had been something buried in Little Whitford for nearly 20 years, and someone had decided it was time to dig it up. The first name to emerge on everyone's lips was naturally Mrs. Lavinia Marsh. It wasn't just the old stories, the whispered recollections of her once glowing affection for Henry in her younger days, or the sudden end to her engagement the very year he left for India. It wasn't even her chilly demeanor at the garden party, or the fact that she had been seen speaking to him alone by the arbor just before the crimson letter appeared. It was, more than anything, the way Mrs. Marsh now avoided the subject entirely. Avoidance, as Miss Marple well knew, often told one as much as speech. Still, suspicion in Little Whitford was a contagious and opportunistic thing. No sooner had the villagers begun murmuring about Mrs. Marsh than they turned their scrutiny elsewhere. There was Mr. Lionel Briggs, the local solicitor, a stout, red-faced man with a voice better suited to auctioneering than private conversation. He had handled Henry Calthorpe's affairs since his return from India, and had, some claimed, met with him late in the evening, just 2 days before the garden party. Some said Calthorpe had been rewriting his will. Others said he was simply updating his address. No one could say for certain, but Mr. Briggs had developed a sudden reluctance to be seen in public. "He's usually in the snug at the Golden Hind by 6, noted Mr. Harper, the village baker, with the air of someone presenting hard evidence, "but I've not seen him all week." That's not natural for a man with his thirst. Then there was Beatrice Foyle, Henry's former housekeeper, who had served in his household during the last 2 years of his time in India. She had moved to Little Whitford shortly before he returned and had taken up residence in a modest cottage on Honeysuckle Lane. The coincidence was noted by more than a few sharp-eyed residents. She was loyal to him, Mrs. Weatherby said, with a touch of skepticism, but too loyal, if you know what I mean. Some women will do anything to protect their secrets. Beatrice herself remained silent on the matter, declining to attend the funeral and refusing all visitors, including the vicar, who had arrived with a tin of currant buns and left without a word from her. Yet, among all the theories, one person seemed oddly untouched by suspicion. Mrs. Marchmont, though it had been her party, her tray, and her home where the letter had surfaced and the death had followed, few were inclined to believe she could have had a hand in any of it. "She's always been delicate," said Mrs. Brandon with authority. The poor woman could hardly manage the garden club books, let alone murder. Miss Marple found that curious. She herself had observed something altogether different, a woman who had smiled tightly through the garden party, who had kept her gaze just a touch too carefully averted when the letter was mentioned, and who had made one crucial mistake. Mrs. Marchmont had said she discovered Henry's body with the letter beside him. But she had also told Inspector Cray that she burned no such thing. And yet, the remains of burnt wax and thick paper had been found in the drawing-room grate. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had heard enough to begin drawing her mental map. She placed Lavinia Marsh at the arbour with Henry, Beatrice Foyle in quiet exile on Honeysuckle Lane, Mr. Briggs with his ledgers and avoidance, and Mrs. Marchmont at the Centrecom, composed and just slightly too helpful. But none of them had yet made a decisive move. Then came the second letter. It was Reverend Altham who found it. On Saturday morning, he was unlocking the door to St. Christopher's when he noticed an envelope tucked beneath the brass handle. It was identical to the first, thick, cream-coloured paper, no name, no stamp, sealed with crimson wax. He opened it only after the choir boys had scattered and the church was still. It contained 5 words. "You've all forgotten the girl." He turned pale, folded the letter, and walked it directly to Inspector Cray. Within the hour, Miss Marple was called in as well. She read the note 3 times, her eyes narrowing with each pass. "I wonder," she murmured, "if the writer is pointing us toward the origin of the matter rather than its end." "What do you mean?" Cray asked. "I mean that this letter, both letters, in fact, may have less to do with Mr. Calthorpe's return and more to do with why he left." Cray frowned, but said nothing. Miss Marple placed the letter back on the table. "There was an incident years ago, wasn't there? Something hushed up, something unspoken. Frightful gossip, you mean?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, "something worse, something shameful. The sort of thing that would drive a man to leave the country and others to forget." Cray looked at her, then at the letter. "Do you think it refers to someone in particular?" "I do," Miss Marple said, "but not a woman we've spoken of yet. A girl, possibly very young at the time. Someone not important enough to mention, but too dangerous to remember." She rose, smoothing the skirt of her tweed jacket. "If I were you, Inspector," she said mildly, "I'd look again at the school records from 1932, and I'd speak to Beatrice Foyle." "Why her?" "Because housekeepers," said Miss Marple, "see everything." The following day, Cray did indeed pay a visit to Beatrice. When he returned, he was pale and tight-lipped. He did not disclose what was said, but word spread quickly that she had left the village later that evening, her suitcase packed and her windows drawn. Miss Marple said nothing at all. But that evening she placed a single new pin in her mental map. It didn't matter that there were multiple suspects now. What mattered was the connection between them. And the girl, whoever she had been, was at the center of it. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was beginning to rise like spring frost from the soil. But someone in Little Withens Ford was doing everything in their power to bury it once more. Monday dawned grey and listless, the kind of morning that seemed to weigh more heavily on Little Withensford's rooftops and hedges than the last. A drizzle patterned against window panes, and villagers moved about, wrapped in scarves and suspicions. With Beatrice Foyle's sudden departure still the talk of every tea-table. It was beginning to feel, for some, as though the storm had passed. But not for Miss Marple. She had spent the better part of the morning sorting through her garden shed, ostensibly searching for her twine and secateurs, but in truth, she was allowing her thoughts to settle. What did the second letter mean? "You've all forgotten the girl." It was not merely an observation, it was an accusation. And like most accusations, it had a target. She thought again of Henry Calthorpe, a man who had returned from India not to reclaim a life, but to make peace with something or someone. Miss Marple's gaze drifted out across the path that led towards the school. The school had seen generations pass through its door, but buildings, she knew, held memory in their corners. It was nearly noon when she paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Berridge, the retired schoolmistress who now lived in a cottage near the church, surrounded by books, shawls, and well-behaved cats. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Berridge said, drawing her shawl closer, "what a surprise! Do sit down. I've just put the kettle on." Miss Marple settled into the deep armchair and accepted a cup of strong black tea. "I was thinking," she began gently, "about 1932. A year of changes for little Whitford." Mrs. Berridge's brows rose, but she said nothing. "I remember Henry Calthorpe left for India around then," Miss Marple continued, "and I recall Lavinia Marsh ending an engagement. Quite a dramatic season, if memory serves, but what I don't remember, oddly, is anything about the school that year. Number, prize lists, no village fete displays. Almost as though something interrupted things." Mrs. Berridge hesitated. Her eyes narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and unease. "I suppose some years fade," she said at last. "Some do," Miss Marple agreed, "and others are pushed away." There was a long pause. Finally, Mrs. Berridge reached for a tin beside her chair and opened it, revealing a bundle of old photographs tied with pale blue ribbon. "I kept these," she said. "From the early years, I always meant to sort through them." She untied the ribbon with slow, practiced fingers. Together they looked through images of smiling children, summer cricket matches, harvest parades. Miss Marple noted the names penciled on the back: Sanibel Blythe, Joseph Pritchard, Mary Dean. Then she paused. A photograph showed the school, hall decked for the Mayfair. There were the bunting, the ribbons, the flower crowns. And there, standing slightly apart from the others, was a girl with unusually dark eyes and thick braids. She wore a pale dress and stared directly at the camera, unsmiling. "Who is this child?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Berridge leaned closer. "Oh, her name was Elsie. Elsie Ford, I believe. Quiet girl. She came to us late in the term, just after Easter. Didn't stay long." "What happened to her?" Mrs. Berridge frowned. "I'm not sure," she said after a moment. "There were complaints. Not about her, mind you. About her situation. Her mother worked as a maid for the Calth. Briefly, there was unpleasantness. Then both vanished quite suddenly." Miss Marple looked again at the girl in the photograph. She would have been 12 or 13. Yes, maybe 14. Would there have been any official record? A letter of transfer? Mrs. Berridge's lips pressed into a line. "No, I don't believe so. Nothing was ever said. She simply stopped attending." Miss Marple tucked the name into the folds of her memory. Elsie Ford. She had not been on anyone's list, not mentioned in the speculation, nor remembered by the villagers. And yet, something about her was at the center of it. All Miss Marple was sure of it. That afternoon, Inspector Cray came knocking, the brim of his hat speckled with rain. "I've been to Brimley," he said without greeting. "Pulled the school records from the archives, like you suggested. There's no sign of an Elsie Ford." "Then she was never meant to be remembered," Miss Marple said. He gave a grim nod. "Also," he added, "we've had word from the London solicitor Mr. Calthorpe had contacted before his death. He'd requested a full revision of his will. Everything was to go to EF, not a charity, not a relative, just initials. No further explanation." Miss Marple folded her hands. Then he hadn't forgotten her. He'd been looking for her. Cray frowned. "But why keep it secret?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the raindrops trailing down her window. "Because," she said softly, "in villages like this one, some secrets are like weeds. Pull up one and you find a dozen roots tangled beneath." The next day, as she was walking back from the grocer's with a small parcel of currants and barley, Miss Marple passed by the Marchmont gate. Something on the ground caught her attention, a scrap of paper snagged in the box hedge. She knelt slowly and retrieved it. It was faintly scented, smudged by rain, and torn along the edge. But a single line remained, scrawled in the same crimson ink she had heard whispered about. "She knows the truth." She always did. Miss Marple stood for a long moment with the scrap in hand. It had been blown by wind or dropped by could not tell, but the message was clear. Someone knew she was close. She tucked the paper into her handbag and continued walking. That evening, she wrote a note of her own. It was short, polite, and hand-delivered by Margaret Lane, who seemed pleased to be trusted with such a task. It was addressed to Mrs. Marple, and it reads simply, "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes tomorrow. There's a small matter I'd like to discuss about your cousin's will." For Miss Marple, the pieces were beginning to take shape. Not enough for the picture to be complete, but enough to see the outline of a girl forgotten by time, and a village that had tried very hard to forget her with it. The following morning arrived bright and crisp, a startling change from the gloom of the days before. But the sunlight did little to lighten the air of unease that lingered in Little Wythensford. Behind the lace curtains and flowered chintz, people watched, whispered, and waited. And among them, Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose. She arrived at the Marchmont residence promptly at 10. The maid, a young girl with anxious eyes, led her into the drawing-room and offered tea. Miss Marple declined it. Mrs. Marchmont entered shortly after, wrapped in a pale mauve shawl, her complexion pale but composed. She greeted Miss Marple with the grace of habit, though her eyes revealed a flicker of guarded curiosity. "You wished to speak with me, Jane?" she asked, her voice smooth as always. "Yes," Miss Marple said, folding her hands. "I hope you won't mind a few questions. I assure you, it's only for clarity's sake." Mrs. Marchmont gave a tight smile and sat opposite her guest. "I always trust your judgment, Jane. Please, ask what you like." Miss Marple studied her face gently. "It's about the letter Henry received that day," she said, "the crimson one. I understand you found it beside him after his death." Mrs. Marchmont's fingers twitched slightly where they rested on her lap. "Yes, it was there on the table beside the brandy glass, and yet," Miss Marple continued, "when the doctor arrived, it had vanished. I assumed it had fallen, or been removed for safekeeping. Burned, perhaps." There was a pause. A subtle one, but heavy nonetheless. "Possibly," Mrs. Marchmont said at last. "I was in shock. I don't remember everything." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief clouds memory. But there was something else I wished to mention. The name Elsie Ford." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Marchmont's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as though the very breath had been knocked from her. What did you say?" "I found a photograph," Miss Marple said softly. "A school photo from 1932. She's there, quite clearly. A child on the edge of the group." Mrs. Marchmont stood abruptly, walking to the window. "That was a long time ago," she said. "You can't know what things were like then." "I don't claim to," Miss Marple said gently. "But someone else clearly does. 2 letters, written in red ink, one possibly in lipstick, both accusing, both reminding us of things we would rather not remember." She paused. "I believe Henry came back to find her, to set something right." Mrs. Marchmont remained silent for a long moment, staring out at the rosebeds. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said at last, her voice quieter. "Now, we were only trying to protect everyone." Miss Marple said nothing, only waited. Mrs. Marchmont turned, her face drawn. "She wasn't supposed to be his," she whispered. "That's what I was told." She was the housemaid's daughter Maria, I believe, Maria Ford. There were rumors, of course. But, in those days, a man's name, his reputation, it meant everything. And so, she was sent away, Miss Marple said softly. Maria left in the night. The girl vanished shortly after. Henry, he never spoke of it, never. But I think it haunted him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I believe he sought to find her in the end. I believe that was the purpose of the new will. Mrs. Marchmont's face darkened. He never said anything to me, not a word. And then that letter arrived. It must have been her. It must have been Elsie. She would be grown now, Miss Marple said. Easily 30, perhaps more. She could be anyone, living in plain sight. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the carriage clock on the mantelpiece. Do you think, Mrs. Marple said faintly, that she killed him? Miss Marple looked at her carefully. I think, she said, that someone was afraid of what he was about to do. Afraid of the will, afraid of a name returning to the village. Whether that person was Elsie or someone else, well, we mustn't decide too quickly. Mrs. Marple sat again, slower this time, her hand pressed to her temple. I should have burned the letter, she murmured. You did, didn't you? There was no reply. Miss Marple stood. Sometimes, she said quietly, concealing the truth is more dangerous than facing it. Especially when the past doesn't stay buried. She took her leave then, her steps light as always. That afternoon she paid a call to the vicar, where she found Mrs. Weatherby in a state of barely concealed agitation. It's Margaret, she said in a flustered whisper. The maid from the Marchmont house. She's gone. Gone, left a note and packed her bag. No one's seen her since breakfast. Miss Marple took a slow breath. Did she leave a forwarding address? Mrs. Weatherby shook her head. She wrote that she was sorry, that she never meant to be part of any of it, and that the truth would come soon enough. Miss Marple felt a stillness rise inside her. She had liked Margaret quiet, observant, nervous, but kind. And now, something told her the girl had known more than she let on. Something else nagged at her as well. She returned home and opened the small wooden box where she had placed the scrap of the second letter. She laid it beside the piece she had found near the Marchmont gate. There was a similarity not just in the paper stock and handwriting, but in the scent. Faint, familiar, a whiff of gardenia and starch, a maid's perfume. She reached into her drawer and took out the school photograph once again. Her finger hovered over the figure of young Elsie Ford. Not the child who had vanished, but perhaps the child who had remained, reinvented, reintroduced. She turned the photograph over. There, faint but legible, was a penciled note in Mrs. Berridge's careful script. Ford, E., transferred to guardianship. See parish records. Guardianship. Miss Marple reached for her walking shoes. It was time to visit the church archive. The truth was unfolding like the petals of a tightly furled bloom. And very soon it would be in full flower. The small stone building beside St. Christopher's Church was quiet that afternoon, save for the occasional creak of floorboards beneath Miss Marple's steps and the muffled ticking of the brass clock that had not kept proper time since 1939. The parish archive had always struck her as a place of peculiar comfort, a sanctuary for forgotten things, where memory lived in dusty paper and faded ink. She moved with certainty among the shelves. Reverend Altham had given her his blessing to search as she liked, and she had already located the wooden cabinet containing records of births, deaths, and transfers of guardianship. Most villagers would have passed over the small, linen-bound ledger without a second glance, but Miss Marple knew how often truth liked to hide in plain sight. She found the year she was looking for, 1930, and ran her fingers carefully down the column of entries. Then she saw it. Ford, Elsie, age 13, transfer to guardianship of Mrs. Lydia no known living parent, father, unknown. Miss Marple's hand rested quietly on the page. So it had not been the housemaid Maria who took the child away. Maria had vanished, but the child had remained. Disguised not by name, but by silence. Sheltered, though Miss Marple could not yet decide if the word truly applied, by the very woman who had claimed to know nothing about her. Mrs. Marchmont, and yet, if she had taken the girl in, why had she lied about it? As Miss Marple stepped outside into the afternoon light, she felt the faint weight of dread settle on her shoulders. For the first time, the pieces were beginning to form a picture that felt not merely tragic but cruel. The girl who was meant to be forgotten had grown up among them. Someone had remembered her all along, and now Margaret Lane, the bright-eyed maid who had disappeared without a sound, seemed far more than she first appeared. Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where she found Inspector Cray seated at his desk, a furrow deepening on his brow. "I was just about to send for you," he said as she entered. "We've found something." Miss Marple took the chair opposite him without a word. Cray slid a photograph across the desk. "Taken 3 years ago. Brimley Registry Office. We asked for employment records for Margaret Lane. It seemed she once worked at a solicitor's in London. Not as a clerk or receptionist, mind filing and errands mostly. But take a look at the man she's pictured beside." Miss Marple leaned closer. The man's face was unmistakable, even in grainy black and white. Henry Calthorpe, her lips pressed together in a line of quiet astonishment. "So," she said slowly, "she knew him before she came to Little Wythensford." Cray nodded. "She used a different surname at the time, Margaret Ellis. But it's her. She was watching him," Miss Marple murmured. "Not merely serving tea and folding linens. Watching him? For what purpose?" Cray asked. "Revenge." Miss Marple considered it. "Possibly," she said. "Or perhaps she hoped for recognition. For him to remember. Or even for him to claim her." Cray frowned. "Claim her? You think?" "I think she is Elsie Ford." The words hung in the air. Miss Marple continued. "She took the name Lane after her disappearance, most likely from foster care or some quiet parish arrangement. She might have spent years in boarding homes, changing names, keeping her story hidden. But she would have known who he was. She might have carried that memory, the rejection, the silence for decades." Cray leaned back slowly in his chair. "But why work for him again? Why follow him here? She may have wanted something only he could give. Closure, a name, an inheritance. Perhaps she never meant him harm, but something happened. A confrontation, a letter, and then he was dead." Cray tapped his pen on the desk. "There's more. The post office in Brimley received a parcel last week. Addressed to E.F., care of Miss M. Lane, Marchmont House, Little Wythensford. It was returned, never picked up." He reached into a drawer and placed a box on the desk. Small, heavy, wrapped in brown paper and string. Cray undid the wrapping with care. Inside was a gold locket. Miss Marple took one look and knew. The locket was old, delicately engraved, with curling filigree. Inside, 2 photographs, one of the young women, dark-haired, unsmiling Maria Ford, and on the opposite side, the image of a child, not older than 3, with eyes wide and solemn. A name was inscribed faintly beneath the child's photograph. "Elsie." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "He was trying to give her back her name," she said softly, "to say, 'At last, I see you.'" They sat in silence for a moment. Then Cray said, "So what happened?" "He returns. She appears under a false name. They meet again, and then he dies." Miss Marple's expression darkened slightly. "There's one more possibility," she said. "That someone else saw the connection, and didn't want her claimed." Cray raised his brow. "Who? Someone who stood to lose something by her being acknowledged. Perhaps someone named in the previous version of the will? Mrs. Marchmont?" Miss Marple gave no answer. Her gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and persistent. "I think," she said, "that it's time we asked a few more pointed questions." That evening, she returned to her cottage and took out the box where she kept her own collection of fragments, paper clippings, notes, photographs. She added the locket to it, resting it beside the burnt corner of the letter she had found near the Marchmont gate. She thought of Margaret Telsey alone, now, somewhere on the road, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting, and she thought of Henry Calthorpe, who had waited too long. At 7:30, there was a knock at the door. It was Reverend Alf Tim. "I hope I'm not disturbing," he said gently. "Not at all. I thought you should know," he said quietly. "Mrs. Marchmont collapsed during supper. She's been taken to Brimley Hospital. They say it's a nervous affliction, shock, or exhaustion. The doctor suspects it's been building for some time." Miss Marple's face remained calm, but her voice was firm. "Then the truth is close. People do not fall ill for nothing." The Reverend hesitated. "She kept repeating one word," he said. Miss Marple tilted her head. "What word?" He met her eyes. "Forgive." She closed the door behind him and stood still for a long moment. Forgiveness, she thought, could come but only when truth had been allowed to breathe. And in Little Whitford the past had begun to stir louder than ever. Tomorrow she will speak with Lavinia Marsh. There were still secrets to unearth, and time, as ever, was running short. The next morning brought with it a stillness that sat strangely over Little Whitford. The kind of eerie calm that seems to arrive when too many truths have risen to the surface but none have yet been spoken aloud. The village stirred, but cautiously. Even the birdsong seemed more hesitant, as if waiting. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft grey cardigan and a modest navy skirt, her face composed, her mind sharp as ever. Today would not be about questions, not directly. Today would be about reactions. She had always known that the truth, especially an inconvenient truth, was not something you could chase down like a fox through a field. It had to be lured out, enticed into the open, by the right word, the right silence, the right gaze, at the right time. And so, she would set her little trap. She began by inviting Mrs. Lavinia Marsh to tea. The note she sent was worded simply and politely, with no mention of Henry or the girl or the letters. Just an old friend hoping to share a pot of assam and discuss the autumn harvest fate. Mrs. Marsh arrived at 3:30, dressed impeccably as always. She wore a deep plum jacket, a velvet brooch pinned at the collar, and gloves that she did not remove. Her face was a study in restraint. "Jane," she said, stepping inside, with a tight smile, "I wasn't expecting an invitation. But how lovely. We've hardly spoken since she trailed off, letting the implication dangle like a frayed ribbon." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "Since poor Henry passed, I thought it would be good to talk about lighter things. Life must go on, after all." They sat in the parlour. Tea was poured, biscuits offered, and polite remarks exchanged about dahlias, about the state of the footbridge on the South Lane, even about Mrs. Brandon's regrettable performance at the last gardening club meeting. But Miss Marple was watching and waiting. After some time, she reached for a small envelope resting beside the tea tray. "Funny thing," she said, as though in passing, "this arrived at my doorstep. No return address. Just a name written inside." She opened it with deliberate care and slid the paper onto the table between them. It read, in careful cursive, "She is not who she claims to be. You must see it now." Mrs. Marsh did not flinch. She took a small sip of tea and placed her cup gently back into its saucer. "That sounds like nonsense to me," she said lightly. "There's been too much of that going round. Anonymous scribbling and old stories." Miss Marple nodded. "It does seem someone wanted to stir old ghosts." She paused, letting the silence stretch just enough. "I suppose Margaret was rather good at stirring things, wasn't she?" Mrs. Marsh's hand froze mid-motion. "She was only a maid," she said slowly. "I barely knew her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Curious, isn't it? How someone so quiet can leave such a mark. Do you know what I find strange, Lavinia? That she never once mentioned her full name to anyone in the village. Not even to Mrs. Weatherby. As though she were hiding." Mrs. Marsh looked up sharply. "I can't be responsible for the secrets of every girl who's passed through Marchmont House." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I imagine you've tried very hard to keep at least one secret close." She folded her hands gently. "I visited the parish archive yesterday. There's a record of guardianship. Elsie Ford, placed in the care of Mrs. Lydia Marchmont, Henry's aunt, your mother." Mrs. Marsh's lips parted slightly, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes, grief, perhaps, or guilt. Then she regained her composure. "That was years ago," she said coolly. "I don't recall any of it. I was barely out of school." "Were you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft now. "You would have been 19. Old enough to remember a girl your mother took in. A girl who was later sent away. A girl whose name was erased from the village." Mrs. Marsh stood suddenly, the gloves still tight on her hands. "I think this conversation has run its course. But you see, Lavinia," Miss Marple continued, not rising, "Margaret Lane Elsie Ford was never erased. She only changed her name, came back to the village, worked quietly, and waited." Mrs. Marsh's breath caught audibly. She took a half-step back. "Waited for what?" "For Henry," Miss Marple said. "To recognize her. To make amends. To undo what had been done." She looked steadily into the other woman's face. "But someone didn't want that to happen." Mrs. Marsh turned away, facing the window, her voice low and tight. "She was going to ruin everything. You don't know what it was like then, Jane. That girl Elsie was trouble from the beginning. Her mother, Maria, stirred up talk. There were rumors, accusations. She wanted money, marriage, she wanted recognition." Miss Marple corrected gently. Mrs. Marsh's shoulders rose and fell with one ragged breath. "My mother said we had to protect the family. So they were sent away, it was over, buried, until it wasn't." Miss Marple stood now, carefully smoothing her skirt. "You saw Henry growing ill. You saw him meeting Margaret. You must have suspected who she was. And then you read the letter." Mrs. Marsh turned, her face pale. "It wasn't meant to kill him," she whispered. "Just to shake him. Make him afraid. I didn't want her to get everything. I didn't want the name to rise again." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So you wrote the crimson letter?" Mrs. Marsh nodded slowly, tears forming now, not dramatic but tight and stifled. "I found her lipstick in the maid's drawer. Used it to write the words. Left it on the tray. I thought it would break his resolve. But it broke his heart." The room held a long silence. Miss Marple moved toward the window, looking out toward the village green. "You knew what you were doing, but you underestimated what he was carrying." Mrs. Marsh dropped into the armchair, the weight of the past settling fully on her now. Miss Marple turned back. "I suggest you speak to Inspector Cray. It's not too late to tell the truth." Mrs. Marsh did not respond, only nodded once, slowly. Miss Marple left quietly, closing the door behind her. Outside, the air was turning. The leaves had begun to curl at the edges. Change was coming. She did not yet know where Margaret Elsie had gone, but she suspected it would not be long before they found her, or before she chose to return. And when she did, the village would have to look her in the eye. Miss Marple walked home with steady steps, the past unfolding behind her like the long shadows of late afternoon. It was nearly time for the final truth to be spoken aloud. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple received word from Inspector Cray. The constable had delivered the message in person. Breath visible in the cool autumn air. Mrs. Lavinia Marsh had come forward, quietly, tearfully, and with the weight of 20 years resting on her shoulders. She had confessed to writing the crimson letter, the same letter that had so deeply disturbed Henry Calthorpe in his final hours. She had not meant to kill, she insisted, only to be frightened, only to stop what she saw as a final betrayal. Miss Marple, standing in her parlour as the last rays of sunlight streamed in through the lace curtains, said nothing at first. She only nodded. "Will she be charged?" she asked gently. Cray, grim-faced, replied, "The coroner may consider it. But without a clear cause of death, it may amount to nothing more than a tragic consequence. No poison, no injury. Just collapse. Grief can be as fatal as a wound," Miss Marple murmured, "especially if carried for too long." The inspector hesitated before continuing. "There's more. We found Margaret Lane." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Where?" She turned herself in. "Walked into the Brimley station late last night. Gave her name, both of them. Said she was ready to tell the truth." A slow, quiet breath left Miss Marple's lips. Not relief, not satisfaction only, a soft awareness that the circle had begun to close. "May I speak with her?" she asked. Cray nodded. "She's in the interview room. Said she'd only speak to you." The journey to Brimley was short, the landscape rolling past in shades of gold and fading green. The season was turning, just as the story had turned. Miss Marple sat in the passenger seat of the constable's car, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes distant. At the station, she was led through the side corridor, past low murmurs and clicking typewriters. The room where Margaret Elsie waited was small, plain, and spare. But Miss Marple was not intimidated by institutional bleakness. She had seen worse in people's drawing rooms. Margaret sat at the table, her hair pulled back, face pale but composed. The girl who had once served tea and folded linen now sat like a figure from another world, older, deeper, and touched by something that had changed her for good. She looked up as Miss Marple entered. "I hoped it would be you," she said. Miss Marple took the chair across from her and met her eyes. "You've been very brave, my dear." Margaret gave a small smile. "I suppose it doesn't feel that way. You could have stayed hidden. You could have vanished again." "I did, once," she said. "I disappeared for so long I began to think I never existed. But when I saw him again, Mr. Calthorpe, I realized he remembered me. He didn't say it aloud, not at first, but I saw it in his eyes." Miss Marple said nothing. She let the silence invite more. "I worked at his solicitor's firm in London. I applied deliberately, using the name Ellis. I wanted to be near him. To watch. I didn't know what I wanted exactly. Not revenge, just something." "You wanted him to speak first?" "Yes." Margaret's voice softened. "And then he did. Just before he came to the village. He called me into his office and asked if I'd ever lived in a place called Little Withford. My hands were shaking, but I told him yes. That I had once lived in a house with roses on the gate. He didn't say anything more, just looked at me. I think he was trying to work out what to do. He knew," Miss Marple said. "He was trying to find the right way to make it right." Margaret nodded. "When I saw him at the garden party, I thought he might say something in front of everyone, or give me some gesture. But he didn't. And then the letter came. Her face darkened. He read it, turned white, and left. I never saw him again. You didn't write the letter? No. Did you see who did? Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. I saw Mrs. Marsh slip something into the tea tray just before I carried it out. I didn't think much of it. She often fussed with details. I thought maybe a napkin, but later, when I saw the letter in his hands, I remembered. Why didn't you speak up? I was afraid of what it would mean, of becoming part of it all again. I didn't want my name dragged through it, not after I'd fought so hard to exist without one. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You have a name, my dear, and a story that deserves to be told properly. Margaret looked away, blinking quickly. Do you think he would have claimed me if he'd lived long enough? I believe he was trying, Miss Marple said. The locket he sent, the one with your photograph. The new Wilty had not forgotten you. Margaret wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her coat. I never hated him, she said. Not truly. I only hated being left behind, being made invisible. Miss Marple reached across the table and placed her hand gently over Margaret's. You are not invisible, and you never were. Someone simply tried very hard to dim your light. There was a pause, a long, tender silence. Will they charge her? Margaret asked quietly. Mrs. Marsh, Miss Marple considered. That will be for others to decide, but I believe her conscience will prove punishment enough. Some people live with ghosts more vividly than with the living. Margaret gave a small, sad nod, and me. Miss Marple smiled softly. I think you've already served your time. Not behind bars, but in shadows. Perhaps it's time to step into the light. They sat there for a moment longer, not as suspect and sleuth, nor even as child and elder, but as two women joined by a story no one else had truly seen. Later, Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening, the street lamps flickering to life as she walked. The pieces had fallen into place, not through force, but through patience, humanity, and careful attention to the things most people overlooked. And as the shadows lengthened and the wind stirred gently through the trees, she knew the mystery had come to its close. But not the story. That, she suspected, was only just beginning. The last of the chrysanthemums had bowed their heads in Miss Marple's garden by the time the village began to settle again. November had arrived with its damp breezes and chimney smoke, its cold fingers curling around window frames and lingering in the corners of rooms. But the atmosphere in Little Whitford was changed, not quieter, but more watchful. Conversations were carried in lower tones, and the laughter that once echoed freely across the green had acquired a brittle edge. Even the most insistent gossips, Brandon, Mrs. Weatherby, and the ever-distracted Mr. Harper, seemed to tread more carefully with their words. Mrs. Lavinia Marsh had withdrawn from public life entirely. Following her confession to Inspector Cray, she had left her home in the care of a distant cousin and checked into a private clinic near the Dorset coast. The diagnosis offered publicly was nervous strain, but those closest to the matter knew it was guilt, long buried, now surfaced with the full weight of consequence. No formal charges were brought against her. The coroner had determined, without a shred of forensic evidence to dispute it, that Henry Calthorpe had died of heart failure. There was no definitive proof that the letter alone had caused it, though the implication hung heavy in every line of the report. And so the law remained silent, though the village memory would not. Henry's revised will, found in his solicitor's office, properly signed and witnessed but not yet filed, was declared void by technicality. And yet, in a quiet, almost poetic gesture, The solicitor himself released the contents of a private letter Henry had left in his office safe. It was addressed simply to Elsie, should she ever come. In the letter, Henry had written with humility and sorrow. He confessed to cowardice, to silence, to shame. He acknowledged her existence and named her not as a burden, but as his only heir in spirit. Miss Marple read the letter once and said nothing, but the look in her eyes afterward was one of peace, touched with sadness. Margaret tells it did not remain in Brimley. She stayed for a time in the guest room of the vicarage, helping Mrs. Weatherby with her accounts and occasionally reading to the children at the Sunday school. Her name returned slowly, like a fern uncurling in spring. At first only to the vicar, then to the postmaster, then to the villagers who began, in their own tentative way, to include her in ordinary conversation. "She has a quietness to her," Mrs. Brandon said one morning at the grocer's, "but not the kind that makes you uneasy, the kind that listens." Miss Marple, passing with her shopping basket, simply smiled. She herself had declined every invitation to speak about the case. When asked how she had known or suspected what others had not, she always gave the same answer. "People forget," she would say, "that time does not erase character. It only reveals it." And so life resumed. The autumn fete was held as usual in the schoolyard, though fewer ribbons were hung, and the choir sang hymns of reflection, rather than celebration. Mrs. Marchmont, still convalescing in Dorset, sent word by letter that her house would be sold. The proceeds, at her own request, were to be donated to a small charity that provided for orphaned girls. No name was attached to the gift, only the words, "In remembrance." Elsie received nothing official from the estate. And yet, she inherited something larger. She was seen, she was spoken to. She was no longer the ghost of the village, the whispered question, the name buried in the ledger of forgotten children. One morning, as the mist still clung to the hedgerows, Miss Marple invited her to tea. They sat together in the warm light of the front parlour, the fire crackling and the scent of ginger biscuits in the air. "Have you decided what comes next?" Miss Marple asked gently. Elsie nodded. "There's a cottage near Brimley. An older woman left it to me in her will. Someone I used to help with her garden. I thought I might settle there. Not far, but not too close either." Miss Marple's smile reached her eyes. "I think that sounds very wise." "I want a quiet life," Elsie said, "but not one that hides." There was a pause, filled only with the soft clink of teaspoons. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the green, where the last of the leaves were blowing across the path. "People often think evil arrives with great noise," she said softly. "But it's more often disguised in silence, in omissions, in the things we choose not to say." That letter, for all its color, was only the spark. The real harm was done long before. Elsie nodded. "Do you ever regret not intervening sooner?" she asked. Miss Marple paused. "I've learnt over the years that timing is as delicate as lacework. A stitch too early can unravel the whole pattern. But know what I regret, always, is how often people allow shame to speak louder than love." They finished their tea in companionable silence. When Elsie left that afternoon, she did so with her head a little higher, and Miss Marple, watching from her window, returned to her embroidery with steady hands. That evening a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Cray, looking tired but content. "I suppose that's the end of it," he said. "At least, the end as far as the law is concerned." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Perhaps," she said, "but memory lingers longer than the law." He tilted his head. "Do you think they'll forget?" Miss Marple folded her embroidery and looked at him directly. No, but perhaps, in time, they'll forgive. He tipped his hat and left. And Miss Marple, once again alone in her warm little parlour, reflected on the strange way people return to the surface like secrets, rising slowly through water. In the end, it had not been poison, nor rage, nor even revenge that had killed Henry Calthorpe. It had been a letter, written in fear, received in sorrow, and answered, far too late, with love. Outside, the first frost touched the lawn, and the village lights glowed softly in the night. The case was closed. But Miss Marple's eyes, ever gentle, ever watchful, remained open. Because in a village like Little Wythensford, even the quietest paths often led to the deepest secrets, and she would always be there to walk them.